World hunger. Why are millions of people still suffering and dying from lack of food and malnutrition? Hello, I'm Nida, and this is The Heat. We marked another World Hunger Day over the weekend, with the international focus again on the major problem that impacts about 1 in 9 people on Earth. According to United Nations figures, that's close to 800 million people. Most of the world's hungry live in the developing world. Parts of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa are two of the worst hit areas. One of the most disturbing statistics is the number of children, just over 3 million, who die from poor nutrition each year. And Western countries like the United States are also dealing with hunger issues. For more global perspective, we begin with this report from CCTV's Roy Ruttenberg.
This is how a growing number of people in South Sudan are now getting in their food. The UN says some 3 million people in the country are now dependent on emergency food aid. Some communities in the war-torn East only get drops like these once every 6 months. Many are instead surviving off of wild berries and leaves, but there are consequences.
People and children are having diarrhea. Leaves aren't good, and children are suffering malnutrition.
Here, hunger is a direct casualty of war. To the east, it's drought. The UN has declared a, quote, food emergency in Ethiopia. Mohammed Aden, a herder in Siti province, used to have 300 cattle. Now just a dozen are left.
Initially, we had cattle we could sell at market to buy food, but drought has killed all the animals. We have almost nothing. The situation is very difficult, and without help, we'll only have animal skin to eat.
Children here are said to be the most affected. The UN says nearly 500,000 Ethiopian children under 5 are at risk for acute malnutrition. The picture is no brighter further south on the continent. No water means no crops. Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Mozambique have all raised the red flag. South African officials are blaming what they've called the worst drought in over 100 years.
I'm pretty worried because there has been a lot of disruptions in the season as a result of El Nino coming on the back of a poor harvest from the previous season. So there's a carryover of production shortfalls from the previous season.
Meanwhile, in South Asia this month, India's top court ordered state governments to continue providing free meals to school children during the upcoming summer break. The World Bank says malnutrition here among children is double that of sub-Saharan Africa. In China, the number of hungry people has gone down in the last 20 years, with the global hunger index rating the threat there as low. Meanwhile, here in the Americas, Haiti received the index's lowest score, with more than half of Haitian children now said to be undernourished. In the U.S., the problem isn't enough food, it's too much food being wasted. Last week, prominent chefs and politicians got together in Washington to rally support for a grassroots program that uses discarded produce to make meals for the hungry.
We've got to take food waste off the menu. A world in which 1 billion people are hungry, a world in which we have an environmental crisis largely brought about by the way in which we grow food, is not a world in which wasting 1/3 of the world's food supply is any longer acceptable.
It's a message that may be resonating with the U.S.'s rich and famous, with at least one pop star singing along. This month, rocker Jon Bon Jovi opened an anti-hunger center in his hometown.
When there's 15% of children going to bed hungry at night in a nation like the United States, these aren't issues that need a scientist to find the cure.
Only the people of the world, he says, can save the world's people. Roy Ruttenberg, CCTV in Washington.
And joining me now from Johannesburg is Jay Nida. He served as a minister in the Nelson Mandela cabinet during the first post-apartheid government in South Africa, and he's the former chair of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Jay, welcome to the show.
Great to be on your show, Anand.
Jay, sub-Saharan Africa is cited as one of two areas in the world most impacted by hunger. You've done a lot of work on this issue. What are some of the unique challenges that the countries of sub-Saharan Africa face in trying to feed their population?
I think the major challenge that faces us in sub-Saharan Africa is the issue of addressing how we, in a sense, leapfrog subsistence farmers who are mainly women, who produce 70% of the food we consume in Africa, into successful smallholder farmers. That means addressing certain barriers that they face. Africa is home to about 60% of the remaining arable land in the world. We should not be the epicenter of poverty and of hunger in the world. Addressing those barriers means giving women farmers in particular access to land title, to finance for water, for irrigation, for building their own seed banks, and then access to the market. We could create our own green revolution in Africa based on smallholder farmers. And this would be a tremendous impact that it will have on the existing poverty we face in our continent.
Now, you are personally involved in some of those projects to address hunger in Africa, to address food insecurity issues. Tell us about those projects.
Well, a number of those projects are involved in around promoting the notion that women are central in solving both poverty and hunger. If women farmers are given the right support by businesses, by civil society, and particularly by government, they could become very successful, not only in addressing their household food security, but also in terms of improving their incomes as they are able to sell the access of their products in the marketplace. The improvement of incomes of women farmers, the empirical evidence of this is that in 80 to 90% of the cases, that money is spent on the education, the health, and the nutrition of their children. So supporting women farmers in Africa is central. I think one of the big challenges they face are issues relating to what we call post-harvest losses, making sure that they have adequate transport to get their products to the marketplace, making sure they have a cold chain so that they do not lose a substantive amount of their product that they are growing. And these projects that I'm involved in are really addressing at a very basic level, grassroots level, growing smallholder farmers on the remaining arable land that we have as an asset in Africa. We have also, in my past, been focusing on tackling malnutrition, but that is mainly by working with foods that are coming out of the industrialized process, adding vitamins and minerals into them so that we address the diseases, the disease burden of anemia, vitamin A deficiencies, of people that are living on less than $4 a day but buying their food in a marketplace, and tackling the issue of junk food, which is food often sold to poor people with very little value, is part of the challenges and projects that I've been involved in the past.
Let us look at what Africa can do. We remember a time in the 80s when Ethiopia suffered from serious hunger, from malnutrition. We saw those haunting pictures of children, just skin and bones. What has Ethiopia done to overcome the problems that it had, and can that be emulated by other countries in Africa?
Because I think the Ethiopian government focused again its attention on local communities and on what we call the food value chain. So if you look at the example of Ethiopian coffee farmers, who were normally in the past earning probably about $1 a kilogram for the coffee that is sold on the international marketplace. By setting up an Ethiopian commodity exchange, they were able to aggregate the products of Ethiopian coffee farmers and, in a sense, build a shared services center that got them a better value for their coffee on the global markets. I think it's really up to government to make sure that farmers, smallholder farmers, in particular women, have legal title to land, that have financial support for building their own seed banks, for support for water and irrigation, and building these commodity exchanges, which allows these smallholder farmers in communities, particularly families, to get better prices for the products that they are growing.
The United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has launched what's been called the Zero Hunger Challenge. He launched that in 2012. What kind of impact is that having in Africa?
Well, I think that came out of the experience of Brazil, where in the time when Lula da Silva was the president of Brazil, he introduced what we called a significant support for family farming. In fact, part of the rules that he introduced and regulations and laws was requiring government to buy at least a third of the product and produce of family farmers. So I think the combination of measures to support family farming, the implementation of a major anti-poverty program called Bolsa Familiar, which ensured that people that were living below the poverty datum line, who had money to buy the food that was in the marketplace, helped Brazil reduce poverty and hunger of over 30 million people. Now that experience is fundamentally important for Africa, but it requires national legislation. It requires political will. The campaign itself is an enormously powerful and important campaign, but the delivery of the campaign has to happen at a national level and at a local level. And that's where we need the requisite political will of our local politicians to make the right decisions. I think supporting the community farming program, both through cooperatives or through individual entrepreneurs, are critical in addressing hunger in Africa. And that support, particularly from government, is critical. The support from business, particularly the big retailing chains that could buy the product of these family farmers and community farmers and cooperatives, is critical. But it requires a partnership with political will to do the right thing. I think tackling hunger through smallholder farming will resolve not just the dilemmas that we have in Africa of hunger, but improve incomes, particularly of women, create a career path for young people coming into the job market, and address poverty overall.
You talked a moment ago about post-harvest losses. Food wastage is a big issue in the world. According to the United Nations, 30 to 40% of the food that is produced every day is wasted. And that's not just in the developing world, that's also in the developed world. What do you think can be done to save and use all that food that's being wasted?
Well, I think investment. And investment has to come from our governments in particular, but also from the private sector and also from the international financial system. But it's not designed to address the needs of communities that are poor. There's a significant amount of investment that is going into what is called commercial agriculture. In fact, Africa is very much prey to what we would describe as land grabbing, that major corporates in the world, international corporates, building what we call a vertical chain of manufacturing right down to the growing of crops. Governments that are having problems feeding their own populations are grabbing huge tracts of land in Africa and depriving our own communities in Africa of the ability to build livelihoods for themselves. Now, I think that investment should look in a very different way at the role of smallholder farmers, at the role of small farming organizations, at the role of cooperatives. And this requires a mind shift change in the minds of the financial sector, particularly institutions like the World Bank, like the African Development Bank, the international development system, bilateral donors, particularly governments, supporting what I would call community family farming. I think that is what will reduce the post-harvest losses. I think it is in fact an indictment on our humanity that 1 in 8 people in the world go hungry. If we had to address that hunger It will take 1% of the global food supply to stop that hunger, taking lives of mainly children in our world. So I think the issue of rethinking the financial design that is needed to support community and family farming is critical in Africa meeting its own food security needs, but also feeding the world.
Jay Nida joining us from Johannesburg. Thank you, sir. We need to take a short break right now. When we come back, what is the United Nations doing to fight hunger? And how big a problem is hunger in India and the United States? Stay with us, you're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about one of the world's biggest problems, hunger. Joining me now from New Delhi is Rita Saran. She is the director of the Hunger Project in India. From London, joining us is Greg Barrow. He is the UK head of the United Nations World Food Programme. And with me here in the studio is Jonathan Bloom. He's an author and journalist who writes about food waste. Welcome to all of you to the show. Rita, let me start with you in New Delhi. India is a developing country. It's seen spectacular economic growth in recent years. And according to the Indian Food Banking Network, its grain production has doubled in the last 20 years. Yet it is also a country that has 15% of the population suffering from undernourishment. Almost 200 million people in India go hungry every day. How does that happen in a country that is often cited as one of the big economic success stories in the world today?
You know, the reality of India today is, you are absolutely right, that 1/3 of the world hungry live in my country, that every 4th child in my country is malnourished, that we rank 55th out of 63 countries in the Global Hunger Index. And this is our reality today. And as you rightly said, that we are a developing nation and we are moving fast towards more food production and our economy is growing. But what is keeping hunger and poverty in place in my country today is high level of poverty, inequality. It's meshed in the soil of my country. Women are very much unequal to men. So the gender disparity is huge. There is social seclusion, which is very, very typical to India, which is very, very typical to Asia and India. I can tell you more about India. Rising food prices, inflation, and I would here say that there's poor management and distribution of food commodities in my country at this point. And of course, add to this is the whole issue of governance, the good governance which is needed.
Right, and we have heard some of those issues being cited by other guests as well. Greg, let me get to you. The UN has recognized that hunger is a serious problem in the world. Can you tell us about the role that it is playing in addressing this very big problem, hunger, and some of the programs that it's implemented, things like the Zero Hunger Challenge?
Well, thank you. And let me just start by talking a little bit about the work of the organization I work for, the World Food Programme. We play two roles, really. We respond to acute hunger needs when there's an emergency, like an earthquake or a flood, a drought or civil man-made conflict. But we also try to work with communities and with governments to build up resilience so that communities who are particularly living in places of the world which are facing chronic and repeated cycles of bad weather, for example. In this context, we could think of a place like Bangladesh, where we know there are going to be difficult weather conditions related to the cyclone season almost every year. We build up the resilience of those communities so those communities are better able to cope when the next cyclone hits. But we work alongside many, many other organizations, including national governments and national non-governmental organizations that are focused on different areas. And just referring back to what Rita was saying about India, I think this situation where there is plenty of food in many countries, but people are still going hungry, is repeated across the world. And what we really have to focus on is actually improving access. So where communities are poor, we have to give them the money that they need to buy proper nutritious food so that they can grow up healthy, or where there are ways that we can work with farmers to improve the yields on their crops. That's another area that we're very focused on, because we really feel that there's a huge amount of potential amongst smallholder farmers around the world, and we as the international community, working with national governments and national organizations, really need to unleash that potential.
Jonathan, we talked with our previous guest about food wastage. 1/3 of the food that is produced in the world is actually wasted. A lot of that wastage takes place here in the United States. You know, we're told that in the United States, 48 million Americans live in what is termed food insecure households. Yet we have all this wastage. How does one explain that?
Yeah, it's a bit hard to explain, isn't it? It's almost unfathomable, that juxtaposition of hunger and waste, how that can continue to exist with such an abundance of food. And in many cases, it is that very abundance, simply having so much food available, that those of us in the developing world or the developed world can be choosy and picky with what kinds of foods we eat. And so there is that sheer volume that creates this psychological notion that we don't have to be careful with our food, and as a result, we are not. And at the same time, there is that economic factor as well in the United States, where we are near all-time lows in the percentage of household spending that goes toward our food supply, and this is for the United States. And so it additionally creates that notion in our minds where we don't have to watch what we eat, and we don't have to be careful with how we treat our food, because there's plenty more and it doesn't cost very much.
Rita, you talked a moment ago about some of the problems that India faces in feeding its population, some of the challenges that it faces, things like poor infrastructure, bad storage, bad governance, inequality. What about things like the provision of clean water, poor sanitation? How does that contribute to hunger in a country like India?
You know the situation in India today is that we account for 60% of the world's open defecation. 70% of Indians live in rural areas where 89% households have no toilets, and 77 million people lack access to safe water. The thing today is that the government of India is very committed to changing this situation, providing toilets, clean sanitation, clean drinking water. But that is not, half of the time the women in the villages spend in walking and fetching water rather than going to school or attending a skill development training program or anything which can earn her a livelihood. But she's not able to do that because she has to walk miles to get water, and there is no water and there is drought. So these are severe situations in my country, and almost 38 million Indians are affected by waterborne diseases annually. Efforts by government and commitment is there, but let me tell you, the non-governmental organizations in my country are also doing very good work like us. In the Hunger Project, for example, even if the government builds the toilets and tries to get water, people are not going to use the toilets because there's a cultural issue involved. Who is going to make that cultural issue turn around for people? Who is going to tell them that toilets is good for them, it's hygienic, it will stop diarrhea, it will stop waterborne diseases, it will help them have good health, then they can earn, then they can go to school. This is the work that the Hunger Project does with the communities in the villages, with the women who are elected to local governance, to talk to people, to talk to every household, to say that we must have clean drinking water and toilet in every household.
Greg, which countries around the world are making the most progress in addressing hunger, and what are the biggest challenges in the years ahead?
Well, I think India and China are two countries that stand out actually as making progress, but because of the sheer volume of people and the scale and the numbers we're talking about, there are still many, many undernourished people in those areas. But we have seen great progress in many parts of Asia. The real challenging areas are in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think there are two factors that are really driving the challenge in those areas. One is the impact of climate change, and the second area, which not only affects sub-Saharan Africa but also affects the Middle East region at the moment, is the impact of conflict. When you bring climate change and conflict into the mix, these are real game changers, and these make the challenge of our goal, reaching zero hunger, which is part of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, so much harder.
Jonathan, how is the problem of hunger being addressed in the United States? Is it a priority? Do you see evidence of that the government recognizes that there is a problem they have here?
Well, I see a lot of lip service being paid to the issue of hunger, but I don't see a lot of real commitment and action.
Right.
And certainly there's a lot of good work being done by nonprofit organizations, but I think there's a role for government to do more. And frankly, the real problem with hunger in this country is apathy. And the notion that hunger still exists even surprises some people. And so it is an issue, much like wasted food, that sort of hides in plain sight. And if you're just going about your everyday life, unless you live in a big city where you might run into homeless people, you're not going to encounter hunger or even poverty for the most part. And much like many of our problems in the U.S., it tends to be swept under the rug to a certain extent.
Right, Rita, very quickly, if you could tell us, what kind of progress is India making in addressing the problem of hunger, and can we expect significant improvement in the years ahead?
Yes, you know what, at this point, the biggest gain as far as I, as an Indian, is concerned, that we are accepting the fact officially that we are a country which is having the maximum number of malnourished people and the largest hungry people live in my country. So first step is that we've accepted that fact. The second step is that India is making a big progress, whether it is government or it is civil society. Look at the number of private sector people for the first time who are jumping into the fray to end hunger in my country. It never happened 10 years ago, 5 years ago. It is now that the corporate private sector is talking about it. The government is committed to SDGs. We are, in the past decade, child wasting fell from 20 to 15%, very little, yet there it is. Stunting fell from 48 to 39%. We are committed to SDGs. Our ICDS programs are doing well in the schools. Midday meal school is also one of the popular programs. The thing is that the government is committed. The thing is that now average normal Indian has woken up to the shameful fact of hunger and malnutrition in this country, and they all want to put an end to it. So there is a collective advocacy on it, collective advocacy.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Rita Sarin, Greg Barrow, Jonathan Bloom, thanks to all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd also like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page. You'll find that at CCTV America. I'm Arnold Nida in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.